The following special edition of Siskel and Ebert is brought to you by Orville Redenbacher, the first and last name in popcorn.
The Last Picture Show.
Give him the spinner, kid.
The Last Detail.
No, you recorded everything. Nobody knows how you did it, though, Harry.
The Conversation. What do these three films have in common? A lot. They're superb American films made in the last golden era of American movie making, the early 70s. And a 20-year look back at that era and what American movies had then that they don't have today is the subject of this special edition of Siskel and Ebert. You're going to get some great video rental ideas from this show. I'm Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune.
And I'm Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times. Gene and I, like a lot of people, are disillusioned with most of the major Hollywood movies coming out these days. They lack daring and originality and seem to be inspired by the marketing department, not the creative department. And so on this special program, we'll be taking you back some 20 years to a time when you didn't experience déjà vu whenever you went to the movies. We picked a film apiece, a great film from the first 5 years of the 70s, starting with the year 1970. The Oscar nominees for Best Picture that year were Airport, believe it or not, Five Easy Pieces, Love Story, MASH, and the winner, Patton. It says something for filmmaking in those days that a movie like Bob Rafelson's Five Easy Pieces would get an Oscar nomination, and even today, 23 years later, it stands up as a strong and original work of art.
Hey, what's going on?
The movie stars Jack Nicholson as Robert Eroica Dupuy. His middle name is named after a Beethoven symphony, who at the beginning of the film is a roustabout working in the oil fields, but then is revealed as the rebellious son of a literate and musical family in the Pacific Northwest.
How could you no longer play at all? I think that's very strange.
I played a little bit here and there. As a matter of fact, once I was a rehearsal pianist.
For ballet and opera?
Las Vegas Musical Review.
You don't call that music.
Oh, yes, I do. It's music.
Five Easy Pieces was about a man who couldn't deal with his family because he didn't feel good enough for them. A man with a lot of anger, a rebel who fought little fights instead of big ones. It was like watching great fiction, which allowed his characters all of the freedom of real life. But today, I think a movie like this would never get financed because it doesn't fit any categories, and you can't describe it in a single line of slick ad copy.
And they would want a happy ending slapped onto the picture.
Yeah.
This is a great American film, and Jack Nicholson is the great American actor of this early era,
Yes,
this golden era. This was a guy who made a series of portraits during these years of disaffected American men who were unhappy in themselves. We're going to be looking at more of him in selections that I know that I came up with. This is a great picture and a great acting job. My selection from the year 1970 is Robert Altman's MASH, and Altman, I think, is the key director of this era, taking one film genre after another and revitalizing it. With MASH, the military service comedy, setting it in Korea, but making it relevant to the then-raging Vietnam War disaster.
I demand an explanation.
Somebody get that dirty old man out of this operating theater.
Dirty old man. I'm Colonel Merrill.
I don't care if you're Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy. If his chest gets infected, I will tell the congressman who did it. Scissors, please.
What makes this film so special is that its hippie surgeons, played by Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland, are as talented medically as they are rebellious. Counterculture types could be heroes, too. Another great American movie.
You know, watching MASH and the Altman movies of the early 70s made you feel smart, because the average movie was like a little toy train where first came the engine and then came one car after another, one scene after another. And Altman was like a juggling act in which everything was happening at once, and you could make the connections, and you could look in the background of a shot and see something that was going to pay off in the next shot, so that it was really alive in a way that movies hadn't been.
The point of doing this show, I think, is to really inspire the Hollywood community to say, hey, look, this is in your recent past. This is in your lifetime. You just honored Nicholson, Eastwood, and Hackman and Pacino at the Oscars. Look at what they've just done. Let's get back into it again.
Be a great idea. When we come back, two great films from 1971, and once again, Jack Nicholson is involved.
Continuing our tribute to the early 1970s, the last golden age of American movie making, we turn to the year 1971, and the nominees then for Best Picture were A Clockwork Orange, Fiddler on the Roof, The French Connection, The Last Picture Show, and Nicholas and Alexandra. The winner was William Friedkin's The French Connection, but my choice of American films made then that wouldn't be made today is Mike Nichols' Carnal Knowledge, with Jack Nicholson in one of his many portraits in the early 70s as a disaffected young man who doesn't like himself very much and takes it out on the women in his life. Here, his target is Anne Margaret.
At one time, it was great what we had. The kidding around, it can't have a natural time span. Affairs can't dissolve in a good way. There's always got to be poison. I don't see why. I really don't see why.
Carnal Knowledge was written by Jules Pfeiffer, and it was merciless in its portrayal of the way men and women abuse each other. It was rated X, and it has a frankness and a pain that we don't find in today's American movies.
You know, today's movies are feel-good movies. I just saw an ad for the movie This Boy's Life, which is a movie about child abuse. And the ad would make you think this was the happiest family that was ever put on the screen. Everybody's smiling, they're laughing, they love each other, because Hollywood is afraid to let the audience think that any movie might be about something less than total affirmation of every single person in the audience and what wonderful people they are. And Carnal Knowledge didn't do that. It was a very critical film.
Well, here's the other thing. We have a whole genre of television shows, interview shows, Oprah Winfrey, all these shows like this that are telling people what they didn't know back 20 years ago, that there is all this kind of abusive behavior going on, okay? So there's been an information explosion, and yet our movies have retreated from this.
That's right.
Whereas you would think daytime television has raised the stakes that the movies aren't answering. And
movies are living in a never land, and it's too bad because in the 70s they were living more in the real world.
Carnal Knowledge is a film that is completely relevant today.
Okay, my selection from 1971 is another film that might not get made today. Peter Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show. It was about a small town where old values were dying and young people who no longer felt they had a future were living. The man who owned the picture show, played by Ben Johnson, remembered when things were better. His memories were an inspiration for his young listeners.
I used to own this land, you know. First time I watered a horse at this tank was more than 40 years ago. I reckon the reason why I always drag you out here is probably I'm just as sentimental as the next fella when it comes to old times.
Bogdanovich photographed The Last Picture Show in black and white because somehow black and white movies are the ones we love the best when we look at the old classics. Could you make a movie about the death of a small town today? Maybe, but maybe not, and certainly not in black and white, which was absolutely essential to the film's effect.
I'll tell you another thing that wouldn't be done today about Last Picture Show is the depth of the writing across the characters. The Ellen Burstyn character would have been dropped out. It wasn't essential. You would have had the movie basically be about the town tease. Sybil Shepherd, the most exploitable angle, and the guy who was her friend, and that's what it would have been about, and maybe Ben Johnson, and everyone else would have been dropped away. This is a very rich film.
One of the things that has happened is that as star salaries have gone up, producers and directors, and maybe the stars themselves, have wanted to see the top-paid guy in the movie on screen all the time. Now, the great movies of the past, not only in the 70s, but in the 40s and the 30s,
ensemble films.
Had ensembles. They had great supporting performances. So you had depth. You felt as if the character lived in an entire world instead of just inhabited it all by himself.
Coming up next, our selections of the great American films from 1972.
Now let's move on to 1972 and our survey of the last golden age in Hollywood filmmaking, the early 1970s. The 5 Best Picture nominees that year were Cabaret, Deliverance, The Immigrants, The Godfather, and Sounder. And the winner, of course, was The Godfather, still one of the greatest of American films. Another great film that year was John Huston's Fat City, a boxing picture starring Stacy Keach as a has-been fighter desperately trying to hold on to a profession that has passed him by.
If I get into shape, I know I can still fight.
Why don't you then?
I'm gonna.
Yeah, sure. I heard that one before.
I am.
Sure.
There's always been a great Hollywood fondness for the happy ending, and in sports pictures, for the plot that ends in a victory, or best of all, a comeback victory for the underdog. Those endings have become so predictable, it's sort of a shock to see a movie about the downside of professional sports. It's about a man trying to put together a living doing something he's no longer very good at for people who don't care very much about him anyway. John Huston himself was once a professional boxer, And in Fat City, he used a lot of what he knew and what he had seen.
Yeah, I mean, maybe because it was John Huston, if he were alive today, maybe he could get this made at a cheap price. But other than that, the style of this picture, and I think you focus on something very important, which is the desire to present characters who are likable.
Yeah, who are winners.
Yeah, and the characters here in Fat City, every single one of them, you wouldn't find actors that would want to play these characters because they would be worried it would be bad for their image. And that's what a lot of these great movies were about, presenting a full range of emotions in American characters. Okay, I'm picking another film from 1972. Robert Altman, one of his lesser-known jewels from the early 70s, The Long Goodbye, his rewriting of the detective story, with Elliot Gould playing a ramshackle version of Raymond Chandler's classic gumshoe Philip Marlowe, investigating a murder and finding out, much to his sad own surprise, that just about everyone is lying to him.
Are you looking for someone?
Yes. No, I'm going to deliver this book.
To whom are you delivering the book?
Oh, the man who wrote it, Roger Wade.
But they told you at the office there's no one here by that name.
Are you Dr. Berenger?
Good morning, Dr. Berenger.
Yeah, they told me at the office you weren't here either.
The Long Goodbye is sort of a goodbye to the romance of the private eye. Altman was deconstructing myths and movie genres a full decade before that term became popular. The Long Goodbye really envelops us in a mysterious world. Altman's Philip Marlowe investigates others because he's afraid to investigate himself. It's a fascinating piece of movie making.
It is a fascinating piece of movie making, and it's also a fascinating piece of movie photography. The cinematography in that film was so great, with its night times and with its shadows and with the vistas behind through the windows. It was a wonderful film. And, you know, as we talk about Altman, as we talk about Nicholson, we realize that these people who are still around today, you know, particularly Altman, could have been continuing to make films like this if the style hadn't changed. Altman didn't change. Hollywood moved away from it. Coming up next, two great films from 1973, including the first really great film directed by Martin Scorsese.
Continuing our tribute to the early 1970s, the last golden era of American movie making, the nominees for Best Picture of 1973 were American Graffiti, Cries and Whispers, The Exorcist, The Sting, and A Touch of Class. And the winner was George Roy Hill's The Sting. But my selection is Hal Ashby's The Last Detail, with possibly Jack Nicholson's best performance on film, and that's saying a lot. Playing a career sailor, working with another career swabby, Otis Young, as they take a young sailor, Randy Quaid, across the eastern seaboard to the brig.
Where you going? Okay.
Yeah, well, now, if that don't make you just want to in your flat hat, man. Look what you went, look what you... I hope you're satisfied.
But you're the one who insisted we take him to see his mother.
I've seen The Last Detail at least 15 times. I adore it. It's based on Daryl Ponnickson's novel. Nicholson has never been better, and Otis Young's character remains fresh as a rare instance of an African-American in the movies in which his blackness wasn't the most and only important thing about him. He was just another career sailor. This movie has a bittersweet, life-goes-on ending that would not be made today. It's a great American film. Foul-mouthed as any Navy film you could imagine. I urge you to see it. This is a fantastic
It is a terrific film. And, you know, I've just been trying to find some sort of a pattern in some of these films we've been talking about. And in this case, here you have, and reflecting the atmosphere in the early 70s, a real outsider. That scene where Nicholson goes into the bar and has the showdown with the obstreperous bartender indicates in his mind that he is an outsider and that the world is against him. And today, so many of the heroes don't feel like outsiders, don't feel powerless, because they are the ones making all the decisions. And it's kind of boring to always see movie characters who prevail on the screen. It's great occasionally to see a guy who feels like he has to struggle.
Well, you know, the movies began as the Nickelodeon, and the nickel admission was the most democratic art form. It was the struggling masses, and so you had Chaplin, the quintessential early movie figure, rebelling against people, and Nicholson coming in with saltier language into the bar and say, I am the blank Shore Patrol, is the kind of scene that Chaplin would have done years ago to play to the crowds, and here we have it again, a great film.
Okay, my choice for a great film from 1973 is Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets, the film that announced with a fanfare that he was one of the best of a new generation of directors. The movie was made on a low budget with unknown actors who were later to become famous, like Robert De Niro and Harvey Keitel, and it took place on the streets of Little Italy, where Scorsese grew up observing guys exactly like this.
I was in a game. I had like $600-700, right?
You gotta be kidding.
Yeah, that's the street. You know Joey Clams?
Yeah.
Joey Scala, yeah.
I know him too, yeah.
Yeah, Joey Scala's Joey Clams.
Right.
Right.
They're the same person.
Yeah. Hey.
There have been a lot of tough ethnic gangster pictures before and after Mean Streets, but what made this one special is that it depended on the personalities of its characters. not on some canned plot outline. It was about how young they were and how insecure and trying to act like tough guys when inside they were trembling. With Mean Streets and 3 years later, Taxi Driver, Scorsese changed forever the way movies looked at big American cities.
Well, you know, this was also made by Warner Brothers, and that's a challenge because today the more idiosyncratic films come from, you know, independent studios, and then, but here was a big studio that took a chance on a young director, and I think today that that script came in, I think people might say, well, who's the rooting interest for the audience? You know, is it Johnny Boy, the De Niro character? No, he's self-destructive. And what about Harvey Keitel's character? I mean, this is another unhappy guy.
Now, this doesn't, you can't edit a trailer from Mean Streets that makes it look like it's a feel-good movie. Coming up next, our selection of a favorite American film from 1974, movies that wouldn't be made the same way, if at all, today. Continuing our survey of Hollywood's golden age in the early 1970s, the Best Picture nominees for 1974 were Chinatown, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, Lenny, and, unfortunately, The Towering Inferno. They almost had a great record there.
Boy.
And the winner was Francis Coppola's The Godfather Part 2. Now, that was a great film, and so was another one of the nominees, Roman Polanski's Chinatown, which called on the wonderful American genre of film noir for its story of Los Angeles in the 1930s, when the future of the city and of several great fortunes depended on bringing water to the desert. Jack Nicholson starred, once again, he's a great actor in this period of time, as Jake Gittes, a private eye who gets involved in a tangled web of fraud, deceit, murder, and unsavory old family secrets.
You may think you know what you're dealing with, but believe me, you don't. Why is that funny?
It's what the district attorney used to tell me in Chinatown.
Chinatown was a big, expensive, offbeat, daring, and very complicated film. It was about a mood of evil and greed and political corruption, and even today, every time I drive through Beverly Hills and see the sprinklers watering those beautiful green lawns, I think about Chinatown, and I think about where the water comes from and why. A movie like this is too big to be made today. Not too expensive, not too difficult, but simply too visionary and too ambitious.
Oh, well, you start to think of the elements that they'd like to lose from the script. How about the personal sexual relationships going on in the picture? Take that out of the film. I think that would have been done very today.
How about, could it be about something other than water? Could it be about drugs, for example? That would be sexier than water.
This is a very ambitious screenplay. Robert Towne, again, who was probably the screenwriter of this era, as long as we're naming the leading lights of this era. And again, Roman Polanski. Now, this is a great filmmaker, world-class filmmaker, and Chinatown is one of the reasons
It's a tragedy for American films that Roman Polanski personally completely was unable to control himself, apparently, and got into a situation where he left the country, and we have lost a lot of good films because of Polanski's own personal problems.
Okay, my selection is Francis Coppola's The Conversation with Gene Hackman in his best performance on film, and that, too, is saying a lot. Now, recently, I ran into Hackman, who was visiting Chicago for a weekend, and I told him our idea for this show, and it really pleased him. He said that these films from the early 70s sometimes weren't at all that successful, but at least they got made, and they wouldn't be made today. And The Conversation is a classic case, a disturbing thriller about a professional wiretapper named Harry Call, played by Hackman, who was totally cut off from relating to any other person in a real way other than listening into them over a wire.
Listen, if there's one surefire rule that I have learned in this business is that I don't know anything about human nature. I don't know anything about curiosity. That's not part of what I do. This is my business. And when I'm...
Released in early 1974, The Conversation couldn't have been more relevant about a scandal that would change the course of American history just a few months later, the Watergate cover-up and its story of wiretapping. It was a movie that argued for a person's right to privacy, but not with an obvious, safe, do-gooder courtroom script that you might get today, but rather with a one-of-a-kind mystery led by one of the most unforgettable movie characters ever filmed. The Conversation is, we use this word a lot, these are great films.
They are great films.
They've stood the test of time.
Francis Ford Coppola had 2 films nominated for Best Picture that year, this one and The Godfather Part 2. And looking at this film again, what you're amazed by is the way that it internalizes what's going on in Harry Call's mind. I remember at the time big debates about the film, about what actually did happen. And
what did he see?
What was in that toilet.
You got it.
And they didn't have freeze frames on the videos in those days. But the fact that people could talk about a movie and be puzzled by it and enjoy being puzzled by it instead of having it all laid out there real easy for them is great.
This relevance to what was going on in society is very true. I saw this film just having come back from Russia, where I felt I was eavesdropped on, as most journalists were back when Solzhenitsyn was being rounded up in '74. And here comes an American movie that is so relevant to that, and that's what it was like going to the movies back then 20 years ago.
Today, they use the term product a lot. Now, product was a word that was also around in the '70s, but I don't think that people in Hollywood used it so frequently. They talked about movies in those days. Now it's product. It's how much it costs and how you market it and how you advertise it and put it on 2,000 screens and see how it does. And there's none of that buccaneering spirit that the filmmakers had in those days to really try to do something new.
And I remember Gene Hackman telling me after he made that picture, looking back on his career, he said, you know, that one, the lack of success of that picture broke my spirit because he thought it was as good a thing as he'd ever been involved with. But it has lasted for 20 years. It's being remembered today, and the soft, safe stuff, it gets forgotten.
Okay, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be back with reviews of new movies, including Blowing Away with Tommy Lee Jones terrorizing Boston with Jeff Bridges on his trail. Also, Julia Roberts and Nick Nolte as rival Chicago newspaper reporters in I Love Trouble. That's next week, and until then, the balcony is closed.